The morning my father left for his honeymoon, he spent 11 minutes looking for his passport and 0 looking for me. I was 14 years old, sitting at the kitchen table in our house in a suburb of Denver, Colorado, eating cereal from a bowl I had washed myself because the housekeeper had been canceled 2 weeks prior without anyone telling me. My father Marcus moved through the kitchen in the particular way of a man who has already mentally left a place opening drawers, patting his jacket pockets, saying Sandra's name in a low-pleased voice when she appeared at the top of the stairs in a white sundress with her luggage already packed. Sandra had been my father's girlfriend for 16 months and his fiancée for 4. I had been his daughter for 14 years. The distinction did not appear to affect the arithmetic of his attention. Before he walked out, my father set one thing on the counter beside the coffee maker. An envelope. He tapped it twice with 2 fingers the way you tap a document you've already reviewed and consider settled. "There's cash in there," he said. "Enough for the month. You know where everything is." I asked who was going to be here with me. He looked at me then, not unkindly. More the way someone looks at a question they thought they'd already answered. "You're 14, he said. "You're not a child." Sandra smiled at me from the doorway. The smile of a woman who has decided to be pleasant about something she finds mildly inconvenient. Then they wheeled their luggage out, and the door closed, and I listened to the car back down the driveway and turn onto the street and disappear. I sat at the kitchen table for a while. The envelope held $240. I counted it twice. My father and Sandra were going to Cancun for 3 weeks, then spending a 4th week at Sandra's sister's place in Scottsdale, 28 days. I did the math without meaning to. $8.57 per day. I was 14, not a child, so I understood what $8.57 bought in Denver in October without a car or a bus pass or anyone to drive me anywhere. My father worked in commercial real estate. He was not a careless man with money. I understood standing in that kitchen that the amount in the envelope had been calculated, not generous enough to be guilt, not small enough to be an accident, precise enough to be a message. I want to tell you something about my father that makes this harder to explain and easier to understand. He was not a monster. He coached my soccer team when I was 8. He drove me to the emergency room at 2 in the morning when I broke my wrist in 6th grade and held my hand while they set it and didn't let go until I told him it was okay. He taught me to parallel park in an empty lot on a Sunday afternoon 6 months before I was legally allowed to need that skill. He was a man who loved me in the specific way of someone who loves you most when loving you is convenient. When it required rearrangement, when it competed with something he wanted more, the love didn't disappear exactly, it just receded, like water finding a lower level. Sandra was that lower level now. I am not telling you this to make you feel sorry for me. I am telling you this so you understand why I didn't call anyone for the first 4 days. Because the story I had been raised inside told me that I was capable, adaptable, low maintenance. My father had said it with pride at every parent conference, every soccer banquet, every dinner with his colleagues. "She handles everything herself, never complains, you'd never even know she was there." I had absorbed this as identity. I did not yet understand it as warning. On day 5, I took the bus to the grocery store 2 miles away because the refrigerator held a jar of mustard, a 6-pack of beer, and half a block of cheese going soft at the edges. I bought rice and beans and a bag of frozen vegetables and a loaf of bread, and walked home with the bags cutting into my palms. I was 14, and I had a phone and I knew how to cook rice because my father traveled for work regularly, and I had been feeding myself since I was 11. I was, as advertised, remarkably self-sufficient. On day 7 it snowed. Denver in October does this without apology. I woke up to 4 inches on the ground and the heat making a sound it hadn't made before, a low metallic complaint from somewhere in the basement. By afternoon the house was 61 degrees and dropping. I found the thermostat and cycled through every setting. Nothing changed. I went to the basement and looked at the furnace for 15 minutes the way you look at something you have no vocabulary for. I called my father. He answered on the 4th ring. I could hear restaurant noise behind him, music, Sandra laughing at something nearby. "The heat isn't working," I said. "It's really cold." He exhaled. "There's a reset button on the side of the furnace," he said. "Gray panel, lower left." I told him I'd tried that. I hadn't, but I went and tried it while we were talking and nothing happened, and I told him. He said he'd look into it. He said probably just call an HVAC place in the morning. He said the number was on the fridge. I asked if they would come without a parent present. He was quiet for a moment. He said he'd have Sandra's brother check on it. Then the restaurant noise got louder and he said he had to go and the call ended. Sandra's brother never came. I slept that night in 2 pairs of sweatpants, a long-sleeve shirt, a hoodie, and my winter coat, with every blanket I owned piled on the bed. The house got down to 54 degrees by morning. I know because I checked the thermostat every few hours with the determined focus of someone recording evidence, which is not exactly what I was doing yet, but was, I think, what some part of me had already decided needed to happen. On day 9, our neighbor from the house directly behind ours knocked on the back door. Her name was Patricia Okafor, and she was 63 years old and had lived in the greenhouse since my parents bought ours, back when there had been 2 parents. She had seen me, I later learned, taking the trash out alone 4 days running and had watched the driveway and drawn the correct conclusion. She stood on the back porch with a casserole dish covered in aluminum foil. "I made extra," she said, in the particular tone of someone who has made exactly the right amount. I let her in. We stood in the cold kitchen and she looked at her breath misting slightly and asked where my father was, and I told her, and she didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said she was going to call someone about the heat. I started to say it was fine, and she looked at me, not unkindly, and said, "Sweetheart, I can see your breath in here." She called someone. A man named Bill came the following morning and fixed the furnace in 40 minutes. He left a bill on the counter for $312 and said the owner could mail a check. I took a photo of the bill. I don't know exactly why. Something in me had started paying attention to evidence the way you pay attention to weather when you've been caught unprepared once before. Patricia came every other day after that. She brought food and sat at the kitchen table and talked to me like I was a person with opinions worth soliciting, which was not something I had extensive experience with. She never said she was worried. She asked about school. She asked what I was reading. She asked careful questions about my father's return date in the tone of someone building a picture they're not ready to name. I told her the truth, not all at once. A little more each time, the way you lower yourself into cold water. She said keep a record of things. Said it quietly, almost to herself, like a reminder. I wrote it down that night in a notes app on my phone. October 1, 4, day 9. Furnace out. 54 degrees. Called Dad. Sandra's brother never came. Patricia Okafor fixed it. School was the variable my father had not accounted for. I was a sophomore in high school, and I was tired in the particular way of someone who has not been sleeping well and has been rationing food with more discipline than any 14-year-old should possess. My father had left on October 10th. By October 20th, I had lost enough weight that my jeans required a belt I didn't own. I had been making the rice and beans last by eating smaller portions each day. This is the kind of math that works on paper and fails in a body. I knew I was running out. I didn't know what to do about it. My English teacher, Mr. Calloway, asked me to stay after class on October 22nd. He was in his 40s, quiet, the kind of teacher who notices things without making you feel surveilled. He closed the classroom door and pulled up a chair across from me instead of sitting behind his desk. That repositioning, I remember, made me feel like whatever he was about to say was something he had considered carefully. He said I seemed tired. He asked if everything was okay at home. I had rehearsed the answer to this question since day 1. Everything's fine. My dad's traveling. I'm good. I almost said it. I had it right there. Instead, I said no. I don't know why. Maybe Patricia's visits had loosened something. Maybe I was simply too depleted to maintain the architecture of fine. Maybe it was the chair, pulled up close, facing me directly, that made it feel like a conversation rather than a report. Mr. Calloway listened without writing anything down. When I finished, he sat quietly for a moment, and then said, "Can I ask you something?" I said yes. He said, "Do you want this to change?" And I realized that in all the days of survival and documentation and strategic silence, I had not once asked myself that question directly. I had been managing. I had not been choosing. I said yes, out loud for the first time to another person. Yes, I want this to change. He said he was going to talk to the school counselor. He said this might set things in motion that I couldn't fully control. He said it gently, like a warning that was also a question. "Are you okay with that?" I said yes to that too. My father called that evening. "I found out the school reached out to someone," he said. His voice had the put a flatness of a man who has been embarrassed in a situation he created. His words were careful and evenly spaced. "Whatever you told them, you need to understand what happens next. If you keep talking to teachers and counselors, if you make this into something, I will send you to live with your aunt in Flagstaff. You will change schools, you will leave your friends, and you will spend the rest of high school somewhere you don't want to be. Is that what you want?" I said no. I hung up. I sat on the edge of my bed and I looked at my phone for a long time. Then I opened the voice memo app and pressed record. I said my name. I said the date. I said what my father had just told me, word for word, while it was still fresh. I said his exact phrasing, make this into something because it seemed important. I said that I was sitting in a house that had been 54 degrees 8 days ago, that I had lost weight, that I had been alone for 12 days, that the heating bill was still on the counter unpaid. Then I kept going. Every day after that I recorded something. The state of the refrigerator. My weight on the bathroom scale, which I photographed each morning against the tiled floor so the date stamp on the photo would serve as documentation. Receipts from the grocery store where I spent the last of the cash on day 17 and switched to the emergency credit card my father had given me for genuine emergencies, which I had decided this qualified as. Text messages I had sent my father with the read receipt visible and no response. The furnace bill, the voicemail from the school counselor he had not returned. I was not yet in legal terms a minor in crisis. I was, in the language of the documentation I was quietly assembling, a 14-year-old girl who had been left alone with inadequate resources, whose sole guardian had been informed of a safety concern and had responded with a threat. The school counselor, a woman named Miss Reeves, came to the house on day 19. She arrived at 4:30 in the afternoon and knocked, and I let her in and she moved through the space with the practiced observation of someone trained to read rooms. She opened the refrigerator. She looked at the thermostat. She saw the furnace bill on the counter. She sat down at the kitchen table and folded her hands and asked me how I was doing. I said I had something to show her. I handed her my phone. She listened to 22 voice memos. She read the notes app entries. She scrolled through the photographs. When she finished, she set the phone on the table between us and looked at me for a moment. She said, "You were very thorough." She said it in the way someone says something when they mean something larger than the words. She made a call while she sat there. I heard her use the phrase mandatory report. I heard her give our address. When she ended the call, she explained to me what would happen next, and asked if I had a safe place to stay in the short term. I said Patricia's, probably. She nodded. She said I was going to be okay. I did not cry when she said it. I had not cried in 2 weeks. But something in me recognized the sentence in a way that went below language, the way a body recognizes warmth after cold without needing to name it. My father and Sandra were due back on November 7th. They had planned a dinner that night at a restaurant Sandra had chosen, a reservation for 12, her family and his 2 work colleagues and their spouses. My father had texted me from Scottsdale 2 days before without any acknowledgement of the previous 3 weeks. Dinner Friday at Osteria Marco, 7 p.m. Dress nice. I stayed at Patricia's that week. The family court caseworker assigned to my file was a man named Mr. Delgado. He was methodical and unhurried, and when we spoke he took handwritten notes in a small notebook and asked clarifying questions that told me he had read everything carefully. He used the word documented 4 times in our first meeting. Each time it landed with a quiet weight I recognized. On November 7th, my father and Sandra landed at Denver International at 2 in the afternoon. Their reservation was at 7. The Uber they took from the airport dropped them at the restaurant at 6:53. They walked in together, Sandra in a black dress, my father in a sport coat, looking like people returning from somewhere they had very much enjoyed. Mr. Delgado was waiting at the bar with a family court officer. A second officer was in the parking lot. I know this because Patricia was with me that evening, at her kitchen table, and Mr. Delgado called to let me know at 7:18. He said it quietly and professionally. He said both your father and Sandra were present. He said the documentation was compelling. He said you were very careful. I want to tell you what happened in the restaurant because it was told to me later by my father's colleague, who was among the 12 waiting at the table. My father had walked in smiling. Sandra was already reaching for the bread. The maitre d' had just handed them menus when Mr. Delgado approached and introduced himself. My father apparently said there must be some mistake. Mr. Delgado said there was a table near the entrance with better light and asked if they could speak privately. When they reached it, he opened a folder and set it on the white tablecloth, and my father looked down at it. He looked down at a printed photograph of his bathroom scale, time-stamped, with his 14-year-old daughter standing on it in the same winter coat she had been sleeping in. 8 days into a month he was not present for. 12 people at a table near the back were looking at menus. The host was seating a couple by the window. The restaurant was warm and smelled like garlic and fresh bread. And my father was standing over a photograph of evidence I had assembled, day by day, because he had taught me, had always told everyone who would listen that I handled everything myself. Sandra started to cry. My father went very still. The officers were patient and quiet. My father did not make a scene. He was, to the end, a man who cared about appearances. He walked out of Osteria Marco with 2 officers and did not look back at the table where 12 people sat with their menus and their confusion and their bread. Sandra drove herself home alone. The legal structure that assembled over the following weeks was documented and unambiguous. 22 voice recordings. Dated photographic evidence. A medical record from the school nurse noting a weight change of 11 pounds in 19 days. Financial records obtained through the proceedings showing my father had spent over $31,000 on the trip while leaving his minor child with $240 and no functioning heat and no adult supervision. The credit card he had given me for emergencies, Mr. Delgado confirmed, had a limit of $500 that my father had known I would eventually reach. He had not topped it up. He had not checked. This was not neglect by accident. Neglect by accident looks different. Neglect by calculation is neater. It has a receipt trail. My father accepted a plea agreement in December. Probation. A parenting class he would later describe to his colleagues as bureaucratic. A felony on his record that would complicate his commercial real estate license in ways I did not learn about until later. The family court judge reviewed the full case file, and in January, signed an order granting temporary guardianship to my maternal aunt Diane, who had driven up from Flagstaff the moment she was called and had already submitted her paperwork before the hearing. The irony was not lost on me. Flagstaff had been the threat. Flagstaff turned out to be the answer. My Aunt Diane lived in a house with a garden she actually tended herself and a yellow lab named Biscuit, who slept at the foot of my bed, and a habit of leaving notes on the kitchen whiteboard in the morning. Things like, leftover soup in the fridge, help yourself. Or, saw your light on late, hope you slept okay. Small accountings of attention. I had not known that attention could be administered this consistently without expectation of return. I finished high school in Flagstaff. I ran cross-country. I had a best friend named Cora who texted me approximately 40 times a day about things that did not matter and several things that did. I applied to college and got in on a partial academic scholarship to a school in Tempe and deferred a year to work and save the rest. I am 26 now. I work in family law, which is not something I planned exactly and also something that surprises no one who knows me. I work specifically with minors in dependency cases, which means I sit across tables from children of various ages and ask them questions and then listen, actually listen, in the way that costs something to sustain and matters enormously to receive. I have a voice memo folder on my phone that still contains 22 recordings from October and November of the year I was 14. I have never deleted them. I don't listen to them often. But sometimes, when a case is difficult, when the documentation is thin and the child is scared and the adults are insisting it wasn't that bad and nothing really happened, I remember what Mr. Delgado said to me across a table in a family court office in Denver when I was 14 years old and exhausted and didn't know yet that I was going to be okay. He said, "You were very thorough. You kept a record. That record is the thing that gets believed." My father sent me a card 2 Christmases ago. Inside it, he had written that he was proud of what I'd made of myself. He did not say he was sorry. I read the card twice. I put it in a drawer. I have not responded. The decision about whether to respond belongs entirely to me, which is something it took me years to understand I was allowed to have. He calculated that money and distance and my own self-sufficiency would keep me manageable. He calculated that a 14-year-old who had been raised not to need things would not, when it came to it, ask for anything. He miscalculated every part of that. I have been asked, over the years, usually by people who know the story, whether I think he understood what he was doing, whether he knew. I think about this question with more complexity now than I did at 14. I think he knew. I think he held that knowledge in the same place he held a lot of inconvenient information at a distance, behind other priorities, in a compartment labeled for later. I think the trip and Sandra and the restaurant and the reservation for 12 were all things that felt more real to him than a 14-year-old in a cold house running out of rice. I am not interested in his therapy journey or his self-reflection or the card at Christmas. I am interested in the work I do now, which is making sure that when a child sits across a table from an adult who has the power to help them, the adult does not look away. There is a question I ask at the beginning of every meeting with a minor client. The same question Mr. Delgado asked me, in a different room, a long time ago. Do you want this to change? The answer is always yes. They always say yes. Some of them say it quietly, like something they've been holding onto for a long time in a place they couldn't name. I know that feeling. I know exactly what it costs to say yes out loud for the first time to someone who is actually listening. I say, okay, let's start there.